Howdy y'all, welcome back. Extravagance. This is a word which nowadays is seldom discussed in the context of architecture. Yes, we have massive feats of engineering which are taking place at this very moment worldwide, but the current narrative we've become accustomed to often leaves out these achievements. They often don't get brought to light. Now, speaking of light, did you know that one city, above all others, in the 1800s, was world famous for being the city of light? Shortly after the advent of photography, we have some amazing photographs of this city, which we're going to be looking at today. Call it a coincidence, but as this city was at the forefront of many other achievements in both arts and culture, as well as engineering, we will also discuss the means to the light as we arrive at another simple predicament looking at this narrative. How was all of this possible? The city of light that we'll be looking at in today's video, well known throughout the 1800s, is Paris, France. Today we'll be looking at the oldest known photographs of Paris, and a handful of these photographs will come to us from the earlier French Second Republic, which occurred from 1848 through 1852, while the rest of these images will come to us from the year 1870 or earlier, during the period in France known as the Second French Republic, which ran from 1852 through 1870. The Second French Republic ran concurrently, almost exactly, with extreme renovations done throughout the city of Paris, known as Haussmann's renovation of Paris, which occurred from 1853 through 1870. What we will be looking at in these photographs are not only the oldest images of Paris that I could locate from museums, forums, private collections, and from subscribers like you, but we will also be able to gain an insight through these images of the vast architecture of Paris before, after, and even during this supposed massive rebuild. One thing you'll notice, obviously, is the beauty throughout all of this architecture, but you'll also notice the advanced design of the city. Many buildings appear to be weathered, seasoned by centuries of revolution and growth, and yet these buildings, the ones that stand proud and alone, are supposedly the ones that were being renovated. A few interesting dichotomies are painted throughout this narrative. We also have streets that appear paved, lined in cobblestone and other masonry work. The streets in some instances are wide, sprawling, indicators that we are either looking at a society that thrived with open space or one that had a reason to need these larger streets, these larger buildings, these larger entrances. On the other hand, as we dive deeper into the outskirts of the city of Paris, we find old-world buildings galore, factory-like blocks of homes and shops, and other anomalies which sit overcrowded, structures that are hunched together, which eventually would become the residence for the less wealthy citizens of Paris. These block homes, with many of the streets surrounding them, cut at angles, winding through these tightly knit corridors, covering entrances and windows, and exposing large archways and others, as if to say, this part of the city had been renovated long ago. Again, we focus on architecture, and that is quite a way to learn about Paris, quite a way to experience the old world. However, may I also suggest focusing on the people, or the lack thereof, that we see in many of these earliest photographs. Believe me when I say Paris was one of the largest cities in the world at the time of these photographs. Renovations or not, there should be millions of people, from those who lived here, but also visitors, tourists, and what about contractors and laborers and masons and construction workers to apply these awesome new techniques of renovation? It's not that we merely don't see many people in these photographs, it's that in most of these earliest photographs, we seem to see an entirely empty city, one that doesn't appear to be being renovated. Could this be due to the photographic techniques of the time? Yes, possibly. However, we must also consider that Paris was the epitome of photography at this time. We have the finest and some of the earliest cameras, those achievements and the tinkering that followed to make them even better. Most of these prototypes could be found in Paris, France. The City of Light was also a city of technology, so to argue that the photographs we have of early Paris appear empty and devoid of life, and saying that this is due to the early photographic techniques seems like somewhat of a moot point when the finest cameras in the world were to be found in Paris, France. However, the real meat and potatoes of this video and what I believe makes this work in the city of Paris in the 1850s through the 1870s, one of the most spectacular in the entire world, is the abundance of light which lined the entire city. It appears we have lights that graced every street corner, every home, every walkway, every staircase, as if they were summoned there by some form of ancient magic. We will discuss the numbers given according to the current narrative, but furthermore, I've tried to gather for you as many photographs as I could of these lights and lamps before the year 1870. This is during a time when we're told that most of all of the lamps and lights in Paris were being powered by some form of underground gas. It's honestly one of the most revealing aspects of any old world narrative that I've read recently. It truly befuddled me to see these lights in all of their forms, inside homes, being powered by what's called underground gas and gas pipes, essentially running through the entire city of Paris. Again, we're talking about the 1850s and 60s and before 1870. It sounds like a disaster waiting to happen, but I digress. First, we're going to continue looking through these photographs of Paris before the year 1870 during the renovation, and then I'll briefly dive into the current narrative history regarding the renovation and regarding Napoleon III. We'll finally wrap up the video discussing the mysterious lamps and these lights that made Paris known as the City of Light, and we'll discuss how that was possible according to the current narrative. So let's get right into it. I'll attempt to keep this in layman's terms while remaining historically accurate according to the current narrative that we're provided today. Again, take everything with a grain of salt. The February Revolution of 1848 led to the collapse of the July monarchy, who were ruling France. The July monarchy was instilled in roughly 1830 after the July Revolution. The July Revolution, led by future French King Louis Philippe, disposed of the Bourbon dynasty, overthrowing Charles X, the last king of the Bourbon dynasty. The Bourbons, apparently, were the last rulers of France who believed that they derived from a sacred right to rule, a power that was apparently imbued on their family by God. Obviously, with the growing education systems in France at the time, and the accessibility to knowledge, you had certain aristocrats and even common men coming to the forefront to argue against this sort of tyrannical Bourbon reign. Once the Bourbons were disposed, King Louis Philippe came to power, and this set off an abundance of other revolutions throughout Europe in the 1830s. The old world was unraveling. Fast forward to 1848, and we have the February Revolution, which then disposed King Louis Philippe and his July monarchy. This was due in part to the July monarchy apparently favoring the liberal monarchy and the elites. The French Republic opposed this concept, and furthermore, the Republicans opposed that the electoral voting system put in place by the July monarchy was based around only privileged castle and landowners, while the people inside the kingdoms and the castle walls had no vote. The French Republicans, along with many from the other side, supporters of the July monarchy, would meet often in secret banquets held in castle homes of these rich individuals. These banquets were disguised as social events to those who came to learn of them and question the ordeal. However, at these meetings, the men of the highest power in France were in fact discussing politics. They were discussing the future of France. As more and more discussions at these gentlemen dinners were turned towards the unfairness of the July monarchy that was in power, the July monarchy eventually decided to outlaw these political banquets altogether, effectively silencing the Republicans' freedom to gather and to speak. French Republicans took to the streets to protest, and the July monarchy ordered a state of emergency and called upon the National Guard of France. If you thought that was convoluted, there's much more. Facing pressure, parts of the July monarchy began to resign, but the idea, the concept, the structure that the July monarchy put in place remained. The government of France opens up nationwide workshops at this time, attempting to educate the masses and provide them with jobs, in hopes of ensuring their vote in the next election, which will now include all people, This plan backfires. Many in France oppose a forced education, and even more are unable to turn their few months of education into steady work. Talks of revolution begin. The requirements to join the French National Guard are dropped, meaning that men who want to join no longer have to prove that they own land in France, and this leads to many from all walks of life being issued weaponry. On May 8, 1848, Raspail, Blanquet, and Barbet, with their portion of the National Guard, attempt to attack the French Assembly, which is where the remaining folks from the July monarchy are housed. However, the July monarchy and the Assembly have their own portion of the National Guard. We have two sides here, both being provided with their troops needed to fight against their own people. France essentially is funding both sides of this civil dispute in 1848 through the National Guard, freely allowing any man to join without proof of that person's alignment. The attack on the Assembly is unsuccessful, however. It does lead to Alfred de Fallot ordering on behalf of the Parliament of France that all able-bodied men will be forced to enlist in France's armed forces. This order leads directly to the June Days Uprising, which causes massive violence in the streets of France, and in Paris in particular. By this point, the Duke of Wellington gives an interview claiming that France needs a Napoleon, and these end up being very prophetic words. From the ashes of all of this infighting, the new constitution proclaiming a democratic republic, direct universal suffrage, and the separation of powers was signed on November the 4th, 1848. This led directly into the elections of 1848, where the candidate for the Republicans, more specifically the pure Republicans, who essentially just liberated France, would be running against a man who, for the better part of his entire life, was one of the most disliked people in France. That man, of course, is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, also known as Napoleon III. I'm going to get into a brief history about his life, and I'll also try to keep this as concise as possible, although it's very interesting. Napoleon III was born in Paris in 1808, even though his father, Louis, was King of Holland. Louis Bonaparte often stayed away from his child and was seldom in Napoleon III's life. Napoleon III was with his uncle, Napoleon I, just weeks before his fateful battle at Waterloo. All members of the Bonaparte dynasty were forced into exile following the Bourbon Restoration. Napoleon III spent much of his childhood in what is today Switzerland and Germany. Napoleon III's French had a slight German accent. When Napoleon III turned 15, his mother moved him to Rome, where he learned of Roman history and taught himself Italian. Here, he eventually reunited with his older brother, Napoleon Louis, as part of the Carbonari, a secret society opposed to Austria's rule over northern Italy. Both Napoleon brothers, Napoleon III and Napoleon Louis, joined the cause, only to become major targets due to their histories. Napoleon Louis contracted measles and died in Napoleon III's arms. Napoleon then rejoins his mother, and they flee back to France, as it's now roughly 1831, and the Bourbon Restoration itself has been disposed. Napoleon and his family take up the name Hamilton for a short period of time, before again leaving France. While back in Switzerland, in exile, Napoleon becomes a famed military writer. His first, and some would say his most famous work, is about the artillery of the world. Some would say one of the most detailed reports of ancient and modern artillery ever composed. Again, we have the history here as it's presented, but if we read between the lines a bit, there's so much more that we can uncover. Napoleon followed his book on artillery with subsequent thesis on politics, which both angered and sparked interest from his contemporaries. And I quote, "I believe that from time to time, men are created whom I call volunteers of Providence, in whose hands are placed the destiny of their countries. I believe I am one of those men. If I am wrong, I can perish uselessly. If I am right, then Providence will put me into a position to fulfill my mission." End quote. That was a quote by Napoleon III shortly before his first attempt at seizing the power of France in 1836. Napoleon apparently set out on his journey, beginning in Strasbourg, only to be met there by the army. Oddly, Napoleon III was basically imprisoned back in Switzerland, only to have the French king, Louis Philippe, order his release. After his release from Swiss exile, Napoleon III then traveled the world, first to London, then Brazil, and then to the United States. Again, this is the 1830s. This is the time period that is so key to our understanding of old world history. This is directly before the recognition of technology, which flooded all of the world in the 1850s. And here we have one of the most important characters in this historical timeline, basically making appearances in all the major countries and cities around the world in some context or another. Napoleon III traveled throughout America, and he eventually received word in his travels that his mother back home was very sick. So Napoleon then rushed home to Switzerland. His mother died in August of 1837 and was buried in January 1838. However, Napoleon could not attend the funeral as she was to be buried in France. After her passing, Napoleon III inherited a massive fortune, and he returned to exile from France and decided to live in London, where he purchased massive castle-like homes and befriended the social and political elite. With his newfound fortune, Napoleon III apparently bought all the weapons that he could in London, as well as printed up thousands of uniforms, hiring a team of marauders to help his cause. Looking to garner more support, he set sail across the English Channel, only to be stopped by port officers of France at Boulogne. We're told after this ordeal, Napoleon III became the laughingstock of Europe. While some called for his execution, others, including prominent writers, declared his life was just like the Divine Comedy, so tragic that it was more of a punishment to let him live. Napoleon III was sentenced to life imprisonment at the castle fortress of Ham in northern France. While imprisoned, he continued writing, including detailed lectures on the poverty of France. In 1840, the remains of Napoleon I were returned to Paris in great ceremony. However, Napoleon III could only read about it in the papers. In 1846, Napoleon had befriended much of the staff of the Ham fortress, including his doctor, who brought Napoleon III a disguise and helped him escape on the night of May 25th, 1846. In disguise, Napoleon III returned to Great Britain. He discussed the world with Charles Dickens, and he had affairs with Rachel, the world's most famous actress at the time, and another affair with Harriet Howard. He lived gaining more wealth, biding his time before his planned return to France. When Napoleon III, in Great Britain, heard of the 1848 uprising in France, and heard that the King of France was ready to abdicate the throne, this is when Napoleon III again set out for France. He arrived, he made his presence known, he spoke publicly in France for the first time in years, and then, out of nowhere, he returned to England. As civil unrest broke out throughout France, Napoleon III distanced himself from the chaos, which in return led to his name coming up when the National Assembly voting began. He was actually voted in multiple cabinet positions without even being in France at that time. However, he returned to France, and upon the signing of the new constitution and the presidential election that followed, Napoleon III was at the forefront of his success. In this election, Napoleon III received 74.2% of all the votes, or roughly 3/4 of all the votes. Napoleon III took power in France after so many years of struggle. It should have been all success, all positive from here on out. But this is when, for lack of a better term, the history was retold, rewritten by Napoleon's own hand. Napoleon III was quietly paranoid. and believed while he was supported by 3/4 of the people, those same people would want him to secretly weed out his opposition from roles of power. And that's apparently exactly what he did, removing thousands of government officials, employees, most voted into their positions, from their roles. Following this, in 1852, Napoleon III also enacted strict policies on the media, outlawing any media being published without approval from the government first. This was in regards to political information, criticism about Napoleon being spread, but this was also in regards to the new technology, the new renovations, and the new ability to take photographs. Photographs of government buildings and architecture and discoveries now needed full government approval before they could be shared with the public. Same goes with the stories of the renovations and the rebuilds which we are looking at today. Was Napoleon a great leader, or was Napoleon III a tyrant? Well, when it comes to hiding old world history, he seems to be the latter. Essentially, all photographs we have of Paris come to us after Napoleon III comes to power and effectively alters the timeline. These images in this video are important because many of them don't appear to be in the renovation stage. They appear more like discoveries, buildings, and tunnels that were uncovered, founded throughout ancient years in Paris. Not much of this construction looks like it was recent, yet we're told greater parts of Paris were being renovated at this time. This renovation included the demolition of medieval neighborhoods that were deemed overcrowded and unhealthy by officials at the time. It also included the building of wide avenues, new parks and squares, the annexation of the suburbs surrounding Paris, and the construction of new sewers. This also included new fountains and new aqueducts. Haussmann, the architect, was met with fierce opposition, and he was finally dismissed by Napoleon III in 1870. But work on these projects apparently continued until 1927. The street plan and the distinctive appearance of the center city of Paris today are largely the result of Haussmann's renovation. This included the renovation, some would argue the rediscovery, of dozens of miles of tunnels directly underneath the Parisian streets. These tunnels, said to only be able to remove liquid waste, seem so large and so massive that they could house a full locomotive, and yet in the earliest and only available photographs, we see that they had many open paths. They were open tunnelways with minimal piping being shown. Either way, we're led to believe that a majority of these tunnels were renovated during this time, and the waste tunnels were now able to remove solid waste. But furthermore, something else was installed in these tunnels, something seemingly dangerous for the time, but this something would be the thing that would transform Paris forever and mark the city in infamy. I'm speaking, of course, of the gas lines, literally pipes which ran throughout the city of Paris, weaving in and out of these public spaces, into towers, into streets, into masonry construction, into solid steel and iron, and somehow these pipes containing gas would be lit every single day, and the entirety of Paris, for miles and miles and miles, would be bathed in artificial gaslight. Again, we have direct quotes from the narrative from multiple sources. This is fact, this is not fiction, and here is one of these quotes to wrap up the video. And I quote, "By 1870, there were 56,573 gas lamps used exclusively to light the city streets, and the gas was produced by 10 enormous factories located around the edge of the city near the circle of the ancient fortifications. The gas was distributed in pipes installed under the new boulevards and the new streets. Haussmann placed street lamps every 20 meters on every boulevard. Shortly after nightfall, a small army of 750 Lumières in uniform, carrying long poles with small lamps at the end, went out into the streets, turned on a pipe of gas inside each lamppost, and lit the lamp." End quote. Now look through these photographs, as we have been throughout this video. Look at each lamp. Each one of these is apparently being fueled by gas, precariously perched at all these different impossible locations throughout the city of Paris. And that's just one of many of the greatest anomalies that shape the City of Light. So I'm just gonna wrap up the video there. We're gonna go through the rest of these amazing photographs pre-1870 of these lamps and these lights all fueled by gas, or supposedly all fueled by gas, that occurred in Paris, France. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for taking the time and wanting to learn about this ancient history and wanting to question the narrative just a little bit. We just hit 47,000 subscribers. So from the bottom of my heart and from the bottom of the hearts of everyone in this community that I know supports each other, I want to say thank you for being part of this process. And again, if you want to support me, you can do so here.